We'll start in 1 minute. So we have started the recording. So Shobik, you can start right now by introducing the speaker to us, and then
Right.
you can start the presentation.
Right, of course. So very warm welcome and very good afternoon to everyone who is part of this session of SAIL 22. So we have had in the morning a fascinating discussion with Professor Ken Sato from the National Institute of Informatics, Japan. And to match that and hopefully to surpass that session, we have with us now Professor Elliott Ash from the Center for Law and Economics, ETH Zurich, Switzerland. And Professor Ash works on the empirical analysis of the law and the legal system using multiple techniques from econometrics, NLP, and machine learning. And his research has been published in multiple journals of international repute. And he has also received several prestigious grants from institutions such as the Swiss National Science Foundation, the Turing Institute, the US National Science Foundation, the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, and the Hassler Foundation. Professor Ash has also served as an assistant professor of economics earlier at the University of Warwick. And before that, he was also associated with Princeton University Center for the Study of Democratic Politics. Today, he's here with us to talk about legal information extraction, which is essentially using usage of multiple IE technologies like syntactic parsing, semantic role labeling, entity resolution, etc. And we are really looking forward to see him speak about his research, especially on in the context of collective bargaining agreements from Canada, which is the corpus that we'll be dealing with. Thank you, Professor Ash, for coming down to SAIL 22 and for agreeing to share your very valuable input and views with us. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the introduction. I'm very happy to present this research, which is a combination of a few ongoing projects. And so some questions or feedback would be much appreciated for us as we move forward in applying legal tech tools to social science. As you guys have seen in the previous sessions, there's a Q&A function that's open for both panelists and attendees. So I'm happy to answer questions throughout the presentation. So please just type them there. If there's a question that's clarifying what I'm talking about, I'll go ahead and answer it then. If it's more of a big picture question, then I might save it for the end. Thanks, and let's get started. So the motivation of my presentation today is that legal documents tell stories. The law, the legal system, are humans, actors, characters playing roles, and legal documents tell stories about those characters. They make decisions, they perform actions, they have attributes, they make promises, or they might break promises, and they set norms. And the question for us as lawyers or empirical legal scholars, economists, social scientists, or data scientists interested in understanding these documents is how to represent this story using AI tools, machine learning, natural language processing, how to extract the characters and their decisions and actions, their attributes, the promises between them, and the norms. And you can think of this from the perspective of information retrieval or legal information extraction. And I'm going to tell you today about a few ways to do that. So today I'm going to talk kind of 3 ways to use NLP tools to extract agents. So that agents or patients, so the subject or object of a sentence, the actions, so the verb attached to the subject, so who's the actor and who's the object or the target, associated attributes, so in general, adjectives that are attached to an agent, promises and norms, which in legal language, at least in English, they are often indicated by modal verbs. So the worker shall come to work 5 days a week. The worker shall have safe working conditions. The employer must pay wages on time. These are these promises and norms that are established in contracts and other legal documents, which people promise to follow. And this is kind of a more generic point, is that we're interested in the relationships between entities. And one, approach or understanding or interpretation of stories or narratives is that there's sequences of relationships or actions between entities. Who does what to whom? And that's the case in literature and narratives in general, and legal documents in particular. So the first way that I'm going to talk about this, I think this is kind of like the longest part of the talk and has the most substantial empirical application, is on syntactic parsing. So the linguistic side of this borrows this model of language you can think of kind of concept or framework for understanding sentences called dependency grammar. And the idea here is that in a sentence, a written sentence, not a legal sentence like a jail sentence, a written sentence, there's a syntactic structure of words. So, the fox jumped over the log, that those words, they have a functional relationship with each other. And how those words are connected is called dependencies. And dependencies identify these grammatical relationships between words in a systematic, consistent, and structured fashion. So here's this example from some economic newspaper article. Economic news had little effect on financial markets. And so dependency trees are mostly determined by the ordering of part of speech tags. So part of speech tags, they tell you the functional role of a word by itself in a sentence. So adjective is like, something is a descriptive. A noun is, object, doer or subject or target. Verb is an action, preposition, etc. And once you kind of know these sequences of part of speeches, then you kind of know what the functional kind of flow of a sentence is. So a noun followed by a verb, that usually means the verb was performed by the noun, for example. An adjective that precedes a noun, that means the adjective was describing the noun. And so the way this process works is to identify these functional relationships, these dependencies, what is called a parse tree is built. And it starts with the root of a sentence, which is usually the main verb. So here it's had is the root of the dependency tree. And then some directed arcs are built starting with the root, and they establish these one-way links from a head token to a dependent token. And so you can see that like a word can be head multiple times. So like had is the head of both news and effect. So this is like the subject of the verb. This is the object of the verb. And eventually this parse tree is constructed for the whole sentence to understand how all the words are related to each other. And so here are some examples. In subj means noun subject. It goes from the verb to the subject doing the verb. D-obj is direct object. It goes from the verb to the object targeted by the verb. And another example would be a mod. A mod here is the attribute of the noun. And so here you can see in this example, subject, noun, subject, verb, and direct object is the verb direct object to the noun. And so these are kind of these ingredients for doing relation extraction to identify, attributes and actions associated with different entities in a corpus. So I'm going to show how we do this in the case of collective bargaining agreements in Canada. It's like a bunch of labor union contracts. And this is actually kind of a nice setting for doing legal information extraction during syntactic parsing, because as you'll see, contracts relative to natural language and even other types of legal documents like court cases, court opinions, the space of language is much constrained in labor union contracts. So there's only a handful of different characters, like the worker and the firm and the union or the manager, supervisor, arbitrator. And the set of actions they do is also quite constrained. Finally, contracts, there's a strong norm by lawyers of writing them consistently and in a similar style. So you can use these kind of dependency grammars to extract relevant information. From this paper, Unsupervised Extraction of Workplace Rights and Duties from Collective Bargaining Agreements, we have basically the universe of collective bargaining agreements from unionized firms in Canada from 1986 to 2015. And you can see it's kind of distributed across the country, focused in these manufacturing areas. This is how we got the data. We got some metadata, like a spreadsheet describing every contract, and we got the PDFs text. So this is what it starts off like. If you've seen some contracts, this is what they often look like. You have a table of contents and then a set of sections. So we have to split the sections and then get these different clauses. We first, used OCR to get some digital text. Luckily, the quality of the scans was quite good in our case, so the resulting text was good. We excluded non-text material, like the table of contents, appendices, like wage schedules. These are super interesting. So you actually have these charts that are describing who gets paid what at different levels. It was beyond the scope of our project to analyze those, but those will be very interesting to look at in a future work. We then split the contracts into sections using regular expressions, and we did some co-reference resolution. Then we applied the syntactic parse, so the dependency parser that I told you about earlier, to get the verb, the subject, and the other material in the sentence. And as I'll talk about more in a second, in contracts and in labor union contracts in particular, modal verbs have this really important role where many sentences, probably half the sentences, have a modal verb in them in contracts. So like shall, will, must are these strict modals, may and can are these permissive modals. And any lawyer will tell you, you zoom in on those words if you're a lawyer reading contracts, right? Because those are imposing these legal requirements. They're saying who can do what, who cannot do what. And so starting with the dependency parse, we first get the subjects, and we have this lexicon of subjects to identify them as worker, union, owner, or manager. So like some other words for worker could be like teacher or nurse, for example. We get negation. We extract active versus passive tense. And so you can see, shall provide versus shall be provided. The active and passive there is doing a ton of work. So, even though the words are basically the same, it shows that it kind of inverts the meaning of the sentence. And so this is why we really need the syntactic parse. Just looking at n-grams or counting words would not tell us what we wanted to know. So we also have some special verbs that indicate obligation or prohibition or permission or entitlement. So this is like, worker is required, worker is expected. You can see those are setting promises, making commitments. So our categorization logic is this is basically all the rules, taking the dependency grammars and then extrapolating them to one of these four types of clauses. So an obligation, worker shall provide, worker shall be required, worker is required. Prohibitions, so worker shall not exceed. Permissions, worker is allowed, is permitted. Entitlements, worker shall be paid, shall be given. And so once we've taken all of the subjects, these four subjects, worker, firm, union, manager, and then these four clause types, obligation, prohibitions, permissions, entitlement, we can just look at we can kind of summarize the core claims or the core requirements in a contract. Employee is required, union shall have, supervisor shall give. So that's like the manager, right? And so, this really kind of gives you this nice mapping of what the contracts are composed of. And so, just to, we also annotated some of these sentences and resulting phrases and just checked, did these, clause types correspond to what the actual sentence was. And it was pretty accurate, up to 99% or up to 96% precision based on annotating the tag samples. And there are some errors though, which, in principle could be fixed. So like employee shall not lose, that's coded as a prohibition, but it should be an entitlement because it's saying, employee shall not lose benefits. But we didn't fix that one, but there are a few others, but overall it's pretty accurate. So now that we have this typology of clauses in the contracts, we can use this extracted information to say what do union contracts consist of. This was very difficult to answer in a meaningful way previously, right? Like you could, count the section titles, but it didn't really tell you where authority was given, like who was making promises in these contracts. And you can see that the modal clause is worker entitlements. So workers are getting some benefits, some amenities, some authority. And the second most is firm obligations. So firms are promising to do something. And that's also kind of like an entitlement for workers, right? So, the contract really it's these rights for workers. But workers also make promises. So that's like another big category. Prohibitions and permissions are relatively infrequent in the contract. And the union and the manager are also not mentioned very often. So, you might also be asking, what are these promises about? Like, what's the action? What's the substantive piece? And in order to dimension reduce the contracts, we took the section headers and we clustered, we embedded them using SBERT, which is a sentence or phrase encoder. It gives you a vector representation of a phrase or a sentence such that, phrases about the similar things, even if they're using synonyms, will be close to each other. And we get these main types of sections in the contracts. And we sorted them by, are they giving workers more entitlements? And you can see that, this makes sense, right? Seniority and statutory holidays, recognition benefits, employee benefits, these types of really amenities clause sections have high entitlements. And then the lowest entitlement section is also interesting. It's the management rights, which if, you've learned about labor law a bit, this is this clause that says, anything not mentioned in this contract, the employer retains control over. So this is kind of a pro-employer, a pro-firm clause. And so it makes sense that it has the lowest entitlements. So now we have a data set now of these contracts. For a given contract, we know, where it is, what company it is, what sector it is, when it was concluded, how long it lasts, things like this. And we can use it to understand what are the determinants of these contracts, like what economic conditions are contributing to it. And so this analysis is not in the paper that I shared, but it's in the next version of the next working paper that we're doing right now. And so we have these 5 roles: worker, firm, union, manager, other, and these 5 requirement types: obligation, prohibition, permission, entitlement, other. And we just count these clause types by contract. We then residualize them, so try to adjust for sector cross year, so sector level time varying factors, as well as province and sector specific effects. So this is like bringing in kind of some applied statistics or econometrics. And we have these kind of comparable clause type counts to say, for a given province, sector, and a sector year, what is driving variation in these contracts. And so we use going back to kind of some pretty standard empirical legal studies, econometrics, or applied statistics approach, we use just ordinary least squares regression, where we have a contract I in province S, sector K, effective year T. This is the vector of the contract features that I just told you about, the different authority measures. And then we have like a correlative interest that we want to regress against it. So like, like the tax rate or the unemployment rate. And we just use a linear model to do that, where we put the tax rate on the left-hand side and regress it on all the full vector of contract features. And this is allowing us to look at the effect of each clause, the relationship between each clause type and each metadata feature, while controlling for all the other contract clause types.
So Ash, sorry to interrupt. I just one question about this. When you are saying that contract tie in these different factors like province, sector, etc. So do these specific factors like which province or which sector play a role in the boilerplate nature of the template? As in, for certain provinces, are certain contracts fairly similar in terms of template?
Yeah. No, that's actually a good way to explain why we need that. So because we care more about the variation within the same sector and province, like for holding the province and sector fixed, how does the unemployment rate affect the contract? If we didn't include these fixed effects, then there could be like a lot of added noise and bias from these boilerplate type clauses. So that's exactly why we do it. That's actually a nice way to explain it.
Thank you.
So the first analysis we do after adjusting for these, sector and time boilerplate kind of correlated features, these confounders, we look at the effect of increase in labor income tax. And, the reason this is interesting economically is that a labor income tax, it reduces the marginal value of labor income. So if there are clauses that are substitutable with income, so like, getting a vacation, right? Or like getting more holidays, getting more entitlements, and more generally, those should increase when there's an increase in personal income tax, because it's a substitution effect due to pricing. And when we just line up all the different clause types with by their OLS relationship with the income tax rate, so this is like the OLS effect, we see that by far there's the biggest effect on worker entitlements. And so when income taxes go up, labor income becomes less valuable. So you get worker entitlements, so contract income, amenity income instead. So this shows that these contracts, this is some of the first direct empirical evidence that these contracts provide some non-wage income. And we can kind of say the same argument for looking at the effect of the unemployment rate. So unemployment rate reduces the value of the worker's outside option. So it reduces their bargaining power during contract negotiations, because the firm can say, oh, well, we want to reduce amenities because, you guys won't be able to get another job anyway. And it turns out that, again, worker entitlements have this special responsiveness to local economic conditions. When the unemployment rate is higher, worker entitlements uniquely decrease in the contracts. One other comparison we make is looking at more of the political economy side of labor unions. In the local provinces, the NDP, or the New Democratic Party, this is the pro-labor party that's all involved in the labor movement. If they take control of local government, what's the effect on the contracts? And you should expect that kind of clauses that benefit the unions or the workers should increase. And again, we see that there's this uniquely large effect on worker entitlements. And it also, interestingly, it's concentrated among public sector unions. So like, the union for the post office or something, they get more entitlements when NDP, the Labor Party, is in power. And that's pretty intuitive. Okay, so the second approach to, actually, so before I get into the next approach, I'm also happy to answer some questions about the syntactic parser section. But yeah, please type those in the Q&A if you have any, but otherwise I'd move forward.
If any of the panelists would like to ask a question, they can directly ask so. If the participants want to ask a question, please use the Q&A panel. So far, I can't see any open question in the Q&A.
So the second approach that I wanted to discuss is based on this recent paper we have called Relatio, Text Semantics Capture Political and Economic Narratives. And the substantive application in this paper is more about the legislative process and politics and what legislators talk about. I mean, legislators are lawmakers, so this is related to law, of course. But this approach of using semantics in addition to syntactics to identify narrative statements or identify and quantify narratives is something that could be applied more generally, not just to political speeches, but also to legal documents more broadly. So the method in this paper is kind of enriching what we did in the labor union contracts by adding in the semantic role labeling. And we identify latent narrative statements. And we also introduced some tools for analyzing and visualizing the output on these narrative statements. We applied it to the US Congressional record. I'll show you what it looks like on the Trump tweets, and I'll show you what it looks like in the labor union contracts. We also have this nice Python package, Relatio, which is about to be in its third version. And we're really excited about it, and we would love to help people use it. It already works in English and French, and we're working on German, but in principle, it could be used in any language. So in this paper, our definition of narrative, so like the story told by a legislative speech or a legal document, is this series of events and facts and establishing connections between them. And this is the intuition here is that what we think of as narratives are these explanations or recounts of who does what to whom. And so, taxes fund hospitals and hospitals ultimately save lives. This is making these connections of taxes fund hospitals. So this is connection one, and hospitals save lives, connection two. And you can see there's kind of this web or chain of structure here. So, taxes save lives, for example. And in order to get at these connections, we use semantic role labeling, which you can think of it as a more linguistically informed version of syntactic dependency parsing, approach that I showed you earlier, where rather than just get at these dependencies, it really finds these phrases in the sentence that identify their semantic role, not just their syntactic role. And so, arg0 in SRL refers to agents. A verb is the action, V, and then arg1 is the patient, so who is being acted on. And so some examples would be, God bless our troops and their families. This is like agent, verb, patient, but you can see the riots were initiated by political activists. This shows that, the agent can be at the end of the sentence, right? And so so semantic role labeling is designed to be robust to different word order and different ways that these agent, verb, patient tuples can be articulated. Once we have the SRL annotations, we can then decompose all sentences in the corpus into this type of tuple, agent, verb, patient. So, to illustrate this a bit, if we have, millions of Americans lost their unemployment benefits versus many Americans lost their much needed unemployment benefits, these are just slight tweaks on the same statement. Americans lost unemployment benefits. And so this is our problem or our objective or task is to take these different ways of saying the same thing and resolve them down to a lower dimensional set of latent agent, verb, patient tuples. And so, identifying Americans and all the different ways that it can be said, or identifying unemployment benefits all the way that it can be said, that's our first task. And this dimension reduction or entity extraction step we've experimented with two main ways of doing it. The first is name entity recognition, which for those of you who've done recent applied NLP, this is probably familiar for you. We have these off-the-shelf name entity recognizers like Spacy. Python Spacy has a nice one that will identify people, places, and organization from text, usually based on proper nouns. So like, something that's capitalized, a phrase that has two capitalized words, that's going to be a named entity usually. And the second way we do it is phrase embeddings. So remember earlier, I told you about how we were encoding the section headers and clustering those. This is the same approach, but for phrases in the full corpus. So we have the noun phrases. We embed those in a dense vector space. So we're experimenting with different ways to do this. In the paper, we just used the average of glove vectors. So like these are like standard word embeddings. But you can also use context-sensitive phrase embeddings, such as we're using PhraseBERT and Universal Sentence Encoder for that. I can answer questions about that if there's curiosity in the Q&A. We then cluster those phrases, use k-means, and we experiment with a different clustering, but k-means actually seems to work pretty well, at least as well as all the others. And then we label the clusters by a frequent term, or you can also hand label them. So as an application to show how this thing works, we applied it to all the US congressional speeches from 1994 to 2015. And, here are some frequent narratives. People lose job, American lose job, citizen abide law, Americans have healthcare. It kind of shows you what the congressmen are talking about, right? And you can see like it's a mix of kind of policy problems and then more symbolic things like God bless American, God bless the troops. Some of the mind entities, you can see how the dimension reduction works. So like, people includes people, many others, many people, number, for example. These are the different ways you can say American, government, healthcare. You can see that you get these different references to similar ideas or entities or objects. They all get clustered together.
Professor Ash, just one question about this. This is when you were actually trying to come up with this narrative, if based on these associated phrases as we are showing here, what if a particular statement actually is encased within, it's one narrative, but it is showing in the negative. Like, for example, there is one sentence which says that millions of Americans lost their job, lost their welfare payments, etc. during Trump era. And there is another sentence which says that the claim that millions of Americans lost their welfare pensions, etc. in the Trump era is inaccurate. Now, herein the narrative is quite opposite to each other. So is there any way that, based on these associated phrases, we can actually identify that these two are different narratives? Yeah,
I like that. So for the example that you just suggested, our approach doesn't address that yet. That's very important. It's pivotal in many cases. If the negation is direct, so it says something like millions of people didn't lose their jobs, we would account for that. And so we add in do not lose, like not lose, as a separate verb, like the negated version of the verb. We've experimented with that a bit because it turns out that negation is infrequent enough that those types of verbs, they kind of get lost in comparison to the non-negated verbs. Those types of kind of framing or discourse framings, like it is not the case that people are losing jobs. Those are super interesting. It's a much more difficult NLP problem to account for that. Our SRL, semantic role labeling, that we're using does not identify those types of discourse indications of discourse markers, but there are some NLP tools that do. I think that they're not in common use, like they're just not like quite robust enough to be used across different corpora. But I think it would be very interesting to apply that in our case because actually, I think I might have them in the slide. Yeah. So actually, this slide here actually illustrates the problem that you get these super long sentences, and the narrative "people lose job" is kind of in the middle of it, and our approach is kind of insensitive to all this important context, because in addition to these clear statements of it is not the case that people are losing their jobs, there's also just a lot of kind of qualifying phrases and contingencies and like many important contexts that are dropped by our method. So this is like a trade-off to we get this nice dimension reduction, right? I do think that I think that identifying these kind of negating discourse indicators would be actually a really nice additional thing we can add, and I'll make a note of that. But the one thing we do try is just dropping long sentences, or like only like basically dropping sentences that have kind of a lot of extra clauses. And our main results are kind of similar when we do that. So it shows that these negating or qualifying statements are not the norm, at least in our corpus. But my sense is that could vary a lot depending on what corpus you're looking at. But overall, that's an important current limitation that I think would be very interesting to address.
Thank you.
So using this dimension reduced representation of the corpus, we can still get this pretty subtle representation of discourse. So this is what relatio looks like when you apply it to our labor contracts. So you get like, employer, employee, agreement, seniority. So these are holiday. These are some of the entities that are captured, and you get these, shall receive, shall deal, shall amend, shall perform. You get these, these nice connections between entities that are already encoded as modal verb structures. This is a bit preliminary. I just made it for this talk, but with some additional pre-processing, this you could learn a lot from these. Another domain where it actually works pretty well, just out of the box, is on Twitter. So if we applied, and I'll put this link in the chat because you might be interested to look at that website. We can make these kind of interactive networks, webs of these narratives. And actually, I'm going to see if I can actually just show you guys really quick. I think this is going to be these types of kind of narrative graphs with these connections are going to be really useful for kind of qualitative work or qualitative quantitative work. So you can see, Democrat, Biden, China. I love this one. Biden raised tax, so that's what Trump says. Or Democrat wants shutdown. Democrat commit crime. Democrats want the establishment to win, or establishment and special interests kill the country. These kind of key phrases and tropes and narratives and arguments that Trump is using, they're all distilled down to their purest form by these narrative graphs. So this is actually the tutorial on the Relatio GitHub. So you can actually apply this to any corpus. And we're working on this app that will download all of your own Twitter feed and make a chart like this based on it. So some extensions that are more in beta testing is multilingual support. So we already have it working in French and not quite as well in German and Spanish, but we're working on that. And it could be used in any language where spaCy has a model. And so that's like 60 languages. So it's going to be quite extensible. And we're going to make wrappers for R and Stata. So if you don't use Python, you'll be able to use it. But I would encourage everybody to take a look at our GitHub page. So one more kind of bonus approach to information extraction that I wanted to bring up is using kind of machine question answering for this task. And this is based on a recent paper that we just, it was just accepted archivally for the narrative workshop at ACL, Heroes, Villains, and Victims in GPT-3, Automated Extraction of Character Roles Without Training Data. And, you know, legal information extraction, again, is about identifying these roles such as plaintiff and defendant, offender and victim. And, you know, this is like part of this broader narrative theory in literature, is that, you know, heroes, villains, and victims are these important character roles that repeat across different stories. And so a standard approach for this would be, you have a human intelligence, you ask a person to annotate the stories, read it and say, you read a case and say, who's the villain in this court case? It's like the criminal usually, right? And who's the victim is the person that was, you know, murdered or robbed. And, you know, humans can do that quite easily. You can imagine training a supervised learning classifier to annotated cases and saying, you know, getting the villain and the victim from different court cases. That's actually is not that easy because of, you know, for court cases, for example, it's, you know, it's often kind of implicit or like using pretty dry language. And so you might not be able to get it. Our approach is to ask a machine intelligence to annotate the stories. So basically, you know, you don't even have any training data. You just give GPT-3, which is this transformer model I'll tell you about in a second, to read the story and ask who's the villain in this story or who's the victim in the story, and it will read it and provide the answer. GPT-3 is the newest version of this AI text generation machine called, it started off as GPT-2. Back in 2019, there was a bit of worry or concern because it could, GPT-2 could generate a lot of reasonable sounding, context appropriate prose. And there was a worry that it would drown out like just Twitter or, you know, Facebook or just the internet. Like a lot of fake news would be generated by this. The reason this is working now is this recent generation of architectures in neural nets called transformers. And, you know, just to provide a little bit of intuition about what transformers are accomplishing relative to the status quo, under the standard approach in text analysis or information retrieval or search, you represent documents as counts over words and phrases, shares over topics, or the average of word embeddings. These, you know, basically make a tabulated version, like a matrix version of a document. Recurrent neural nets were this interesting and promising approach from 10, 20 years ago, where they can actually process the whole document in context. They read through and interpret every token in light of the other tokens. So this is great because it can really understand all the connections between words in the document, much more so than a tabulation approach, which breaks down structure and meaning. But it turns out the recurrent neural nets don't work well. They learn too slowly and they require too much data, and they only work on very short documents like sentences. Transformers are a way to overcome the limitations of recurrent neural nets, but also allowing them to get a context. So, you know, the way that I think about transformers is that they provide a way to efficiently read in an entire document all at once. So basically considering every single word in its proper place, not just by itself, not just counting them, looking at all the connections, learning the meaning of all the words and all the interactions between the words simultaneously. Whereas previously this was difficult because you couldn't just provide the whole document as input. That would be too many features. Transformers provide a way to do this. They're powered by this new neural net architecture mechanism called attention heads. And they're sort of like convolutional neural nets in the sense that you can these filters that read over the text, and that you can stack them on top of each other, but they don't read over these like, individual phrases or like 2 or 3 word phrases. They read over the whole document. And for every given word, they'll scan over every other word and identify important interactions. And so there's, kind of 2 types of transformers, to simplify a bit, 2 main ones. Autoregressive models like GPT or GPT-3, they are just trained on this, deceptively simple task of you just read a sequence of tokens, like a sequence of words, and guess the next token. And if you just train a model to guess the next token at the end of a sequence, then you can just give it some seed tokens and it will start predicting the next tokens and generate text. And that tends to work really well. There's another family of transformers called BERT, like autoencoding models, and like BERT and Roberta are the examples of that. And they will, rather than predict the next word at the end of a sequence, you drop out a word in the middle of a sequence, try to guess that. And because it reads both before and after a token, that's why it's called bidirectional or autoencoding. BERT, both of these models can be used for text generation or for classification, but it turns out the GPT models are great for the best for text generation, and the BERT models are best for classification. So GPT is generative pre-trained transformer, and it's now in its kind of third like sort of 4th version. It's like GPT-3 v2 is from this year. And if you haven't played with this, you should. You get some free credits on the OpenAI website API, and they have this playground where you can say, you basically give it some text and it will end the sequence. But this is like, it turns out that this can be used in so many interesting ways. So if you ask Q, what is human life expectancy in the United States, and you provide some examples, some question answer, and then what is the square root of a banana, it'll say unknown. But if you go on to ask it some other open questions, it has read Wikipedia and many other news articles and things, so it has like a lot of knowledge and it can answer it. Or if you provide it a paragraph of text, you can ask a question about that text, and it will provide usually some quite good answers. And so, this is like a whole other level of the scale of machine learning now and AI tools, is that it has read 45 terabytes of text, and it has 13,000 dimensional word embeddings, 2,048 token context window, 96 blocks and heads. So it really learns 175 billion parameters in the model. I mean, like, for those of you who are like used to like ordinary least squares and statistics, we train a model with 1 parameter or 2, like alpha and beta, right? Or a few variables. They have 175 billion parameters to learn in this model. So in our case, we show that you can use GPT-3 to label character roles. So, who is the villain in the following text? You provide the text, and then you say villain, colon, and then an empty variable. And so this is like from a newspaper article about fracking. And GPT-3 can read that text and say, the villain in this text is the person who is questioning the use of hydraulic fracturing in New York. So you can see this is actually a pro-fracking article. And then the hero in the text is the person who wrote it, who is trying to convince the reader that hydraulic fracturing is a safe and effective way to produce natural gas. And then the victim is the New York consumers. And so this is like, it's like asking a human, it's like, this is actually what GPT-3 wrote, right? So there's like a machine writing this, perfectly, literate text. We also apply it to a set of popular Disney movie plot summaries, and it could say, these are actually all correct. So like, villain is Cruella de Vil for 101 Dalmatians, Jafar for Aladdin. We looked at all these and they're basically all right. So all correct. When we applied it to labeled news media articles about fracking, the accuracy is 50% for the hero, 90% for the victim, 47% for the villain. and 63% overall. So it's not good enough to make a data set yet, but this is like pretty nice for making a first version. And this is actually with quite minimal tuning. So we, if we tried to make it better for a specific domain, we think it could get much better. So that was, we haven't tried this yet, but I want to is actually apply it to the contracts as well and say like, for a given clause, who is getting an entitlement in this clause, or who, what is the worker promising to do? Like you can imagine asking these types of questions of GPT-3 or other language models on legal documents. So to conclude, we explored 3 different ways of legal information extraction: syntactic parsing, semantic role labeling, and machine reading comprehension. I think you can also agree that even though there's like really exciting progress in these fields, it's all very preliminary, social science focused. I think that future solutions in how these AI tools are applied to legal documents, especially in the private sector, are going to look very different because, just as like one example, 63% is not nearly accurate enough for a legal product. So, I think that these are all very promising, but there's going to have to be a lot of improvements before they're ready for prime time. So many thanks for your attention. I'm happy to stick around and answer questions.
Thank you, Professor Ash, for this wonderful discussion. And I think it's actually making us also those, from the legal domain who are attending the talk, it also is helping us to figure out exactly how challenging the world of NLP and law can be, but also quite exciting. As someone who mixes popular culture and literature with law during his teachings quite a bit, I can particularly appreciate the last example which you gave of the GPT-3 being used for mostly Disney storylines. It's very nice to consider the possibilities actually. Because most of the annotation, etc., whatever we do, so far my experience has been that we are actually using manual for a version of it and then allowing the system to come up with it. But it can be quite interesting that unformatted texts like tweeters, etc., tweets, how they can be actually used in order to figure out the dominating narrative, because at the end of the day, social media is currently going to be here and it's probably going to rule the narrative building and creation and for years to come. I'm particularly very interested to figure out how this kind of exercise would work vis-a-vis very different kinds of data sources which are well known for their political inclination. As in, if you use, say, for certain kinds of, say, if you use those media reports from Fox, whether the victim and whether the identity of the victim and the identity of the villain is going to change compared to if we use it from a purely left, some media outlet well known for their left-wing tendencies. So yeah, if any of the other panelists actually have any question, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, the attendees can also pose their questions for Professor Ash in the Q&A panel. Anyone? If not, we would actually skip to the next part of the session a little bit early, which is a private session for the link. Just give me a second to post it in the chat box. Yeah, I think that has already been posted. So Professor Ash, if you can see this link here posted in the chat box, that's there for a private session with the organizers. You can just click on that link and we will directly go down. We can go down to that particular part of the session. So on behalf of everybody else, also, it's difficult to convey our appreciation digitally here. Applause is not exactly possible, but we were, on behalf of all the organizers, participants, and panelists, we would really like to thank Professor Ash for delivering such an informative and engaging session.
Very good. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you everyone for joining, and we will see you at the link.
Yeah, thank you.